Richard Milhouse Nixon. We all know Nixon, old tricky dick, the legend, the villain, the lovable little scamp.
Nixon's back!
He ended the war in Vietnam. What percentage of that was by choice, I'll leave up to you. He created the Environmental Protection Agency, because if anybody speaks for the trees, it's Nixon. Nixon even started the tradition of attaching the word gate to whatever scandal occurs in Washington. He also did a lot of really bad stuff. The 1970s were not the best time in American history, or anywhere else in general. It's not like the late 60s were even better, but this was when the nation was really stagnating. History and global events are rarely influenced by a single person, but what Nixon's actions ended up doing, at least with the whole scandal thing, is it showed that not even the presidency could escape being corrupt. Except for all the other times that the presidency was corrupt. Those were in the black and white times, though. We don't count them. So here's a question a lot of people in the 70s were probably asking. What if Richard Nixon was never president? Say he lost the 1968 election, and somebody else took his place. Oh, like Hubert Humphrey? Haha, no, Jimmy. As you see, this video isn't just about Nixon never being president. There was one person who almost ran against Nixon in 1968, but he couldn't because of, reasons. Robert Kennedy, Bobby B., the younger brother of JFK who met the same exact fate. Well, not the same exact, but you know what I mean. So I apologize that the video title is a little bit of a lie, because this scenario is really asking the question, what if Nixon was never president because Bobby Kennedy was never shot? The election of 1968 was something. We had Vietnam, civil rights, assassinations, riots, things were getting spicy, and things were at a crossroads. The results of 68 were actually incredibly close. Nixon just barely squeaked by with a victory against Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey was LBJ's vice president, and his policy seemed like it was going to be just a continuation of those policies. Continuing the Vietnam War, continuing the war on poverty, that sort of stuff. And then there was George Wallace, running for a third party. His platform was basically just, hey, isn't segregation great? And then he won 13% of the popular vote. But this was not the election that many were anticipating. Despite Humphrey being the incumbent vice president, he was the second choice for the candidacy, as JFK's brother Bobby Kennedy was expected to originally win the nomination. Bobby, despite being from the richest, whitest liberal family imaginable, was popular particularly with minority voters. As Attorney General, he had been involved in a lot of fights over segregation, especially when deploying federal troops down to the South. By 1968, he had become a much different man than the one who wanted to attack the Cubans during the first 8 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Despite fighting against segregation and being an advocate for civil rights, Bobby Kennedy was killed by neither of those things. He was shot in a hotel kitchen by a Palestinian because he said he wanted to send phantom jets to Israel. Life is funny that way. Alright, so a little tangent time. I know there's a lot of ideas around who really caused all those Kennedys to drop like flies, but when it comes to Bobby, I'm not here to tell you who really killed him. Some eyewitnesses report that there were way more gunshots than a small .22 pistol was capable of firing. Apparently the bullet holes also don't really line up, so this gives a little bit of credit to there being a second shooter. That said, I also think Sirhan wanted to truly kill Bobby Kennedy. He says today that he doesn't even remember shooting Kennedy in the first place, but he's also said a lot of things. Like there's an interview in the 80s where he said he regrets the action, and then he goes on a 5-minute speech about how Israel is killing Palestinians. From an American perspective, this just seems completely out of nowhere. This isn't a part of our narrative, but to Sirhan, he felt betrayed. Keep in mind that Bobby Kennedy was very popular with minority communities, and Sirhan says that he felt it was very hypocritical that Bobby would defend the black civil rights movement while also giving weapons to the Israelis. So Bobby B was killed because he was a neoliberal. Oops, but what if he wasn't killed? Maybe Sirhan comedically slipped on a pot in the kitchen and missed his shot. I don't know. What would this alternate 1968 election look like if it was between Robert Kennedy and Richard Nixon? Would Kennedy just sweep the election because he was so young and Nixon was crusty and mean? Well, No. While Kennedy was far more popular with minority groups and young people than Humphrey was, that would be something that in 60s America would actually hurt him. In fact, it might alienate him from a portion of white voters that otherwise voted for Humphrey. For all you Zoomers, compare it to Bernie versus Biden. How much this would be, nobody can say, but I would not be shocked if the main opposition against Kennedy in the 68 election is that he's a bit too close, something that is vocally spouted by George Wallace while subtly hinted at by the Nixon campaign. Now, could Kennedy have won? Probably-ish. For the sake of the scenario, he sure does, but realistically, this is an entirely different 1968 election, which probably gets far nastier in regards to race relations. But, let's just say Kennedy wins. What's this new presidency look like? Alright, so there's always an issue when it comes to imagining presidencies that never happened. And it's that campaign promises rarely play out. Typically, a politician will play more into their base during the election, and then be more centrist in office. As an example, imagine if Obama was just never president. Every alternate history theory today would imagine that he would have changed everything, gotten America out of the Middle East by 2010, closed Guantanamo, fixed income inequality, or at least he would have done more stuff than he actually did. And I bring Obama up because Bobby Kennedy was kinda seen in a similar light. Hope, change, all that stuff. Now, the problem with him being killed so early in his campaign is that he never really solidified a lot of his policies. Most of it's just kind of general stuff. A lot of the stuff was just a tad farther to the left than the current Johnson administration. And the main thing they really differed on was just Vietnam. Keep in mind, Johnson was in his own way still attempting to solve the poverty issue, and he signed off on a bunch of civil rights bills that may or may not have been effective. When doing research for this video, and at least seeing old interviews of Bobby Kennedy on YouTube, the comments are always about if he had lived, the US would have been so much different. There's never really any concrete reasons given why it would be different. It's not like Bobby had the answer to it all. Usually people just mean he would have changed the energy of the United States, and Nixon was bad energy because of Watergate. A lot of his fans are those older hippy-dippy types, you know the ones. Had Bobby won the presidency, for real, he would have had a Democrat-controlled Congress that was on his side, one that Nixon wasn't so lucky to have. So in regards to domestic policy, he could have continued on those poverty programs of LBJ. So what would have Bobby even done? If we want to have a good idea for where RFK's mindset was for Nam, it was in his 1967 proposal for how to end the war, along with a speech he gave in Chicago in 1968. It's hard to say whether this would have been his actual policy, this is just campaign speech, but it's the best we got. To sum both of these up, his idea was to gradually end the war by steadily replacing US troops with more international ones. Somehow. I don't know who would sign up for that. Also, the US would stop the bombings of North Vietnam. Kennedy knew the war wasn't going to be won since the South Vietnamese didn't really bother to fight the war themselves. Why bother staying in a conflict that wasn't going to end in victory? And for us today, you know, that mindset seems pretty reasonable when looking back on Vietnam. But the main reason is because, in our timeline, we had Nixon. In the early 70s saw a massive escalation in the fighting. More bombs, more troops. Every option available was used. And yet, by 1973, the US had to flee anyway. Saigon still fell, and it gave this idea of finality to the war. In this alternate timeline, with Bobby Kennedy overseeing the war, even if the same exact results occurred, the common conception, at least among the American right, is that America could have won in Vietnam, but Bobby Kennedy sold us out. If this policy was put into effect, it's true that it would have reduced the American casualties in the war, just by the nature of there not being many Americans left there to die. And with hindsight, we all know that Vietnam was a lost cause. But had RFK actually gone through with it in the 70s, his administration would be viewed as cowards by many hardliners. All the faults of how Vietnam went down would be blamed on Bobby. Sure, tons of young people already died in Vietnam, but those lives lost would be squarely put on Bobby's shoulders because he couldn't see the war through. Essentially, they died for nothing. One of the biggest effects Bobby Kennedy would have in American politics is reinvigorating the American right, which sort of faltered through one scandal and a Jerry Ford in the 1970s. It was kind of directionless until Reagan came. But in this alternate scenario, Bobby becomes the ultimate boogeyman.
It's history's greatest monster!
If Bobby had won, he would be just as infamous as Jane Fonda to 1970s America. Now, while LBJ was a Democrat, he was an old blue Southern Democrat, a remnant of what the party was under FDR. But Bobby? He'd be a scrawny New England rich liberal, the one who made the US lose its first war. And this is just kind of one of those annoying debates in history that we would always suffer through. Was the war in Vietnam really truly lost, or did Bobby Kennedy chicken out? It literally only depends on your politics. To be frank, the 1970s were just not a great time for any leader to be in charge. And oftentimes, it doesn't matter how charismatic a politician is when they're dealt with a bad hand of cards. In politics, Bobby Kennedy is one of those great what-ifs, but in reality, he would always be seen as the weaker Kennedy. JFK is kind of viewed so fondly because he died before things got bad. He's seen as the president of the before times, before Vietnam, before the riots. But Bobby would be president smack dab in the middle of all of those. And it wouldn't be unfair to compare him to JFK. Bobby would do it probably all the time, always evoking his brother's legacy in everything, especially once astronauts land on the moon, and Bobby is there to talk with Neil Armstrong instead of Nixon. He would probably say how his brother's dream was finally realized. So the question is, could Bobby Kennedy have won a second term? This was the election map of 1972. Yep, all of that, all for Nixon. The economy was good, so he was good. If the economy was just as good under Bobby, perhaps he would have a chance. One victory Kennedy would have is healthcare reform. Now, there had been calls throughout the early 70s for universal healthcare. Now, Nixon did still expand healthcare at the time, but his policies weren't as well universal as calls on the Democrat side were. It's very possible, had Bobby been in power, there would be this far earlier adoption of universal healthcare in the United States. What the ramifications of this would be, or how this universal healthcare system would be specifically run, I'll leave up to your imagination. Keep in mind the specifics of the system would only be ironed out by alternate debates in committees under an entirely different administration and political climate. That's a long, elaborate way of saying, who knows? Alright, so Nixon worked for America because he was seen as the law and order president after the uneasiness of the 60s. Bobby, for some, was seen as a breath of fresh air, but for many, he would be seen as someone who rocks the boat way too much. If Bobby Kennedy was a one-term president, his legacy would not be great. Closer to Jimmy Carter than Jack Kennedy. Yet if he continued on and won that second term, he would still not really be liked that much. There were just so many factors against the US in the 70s, and that anger and disappointment was reflected in 3 presidents who are today not really that highly regarded. In this alternate timeline, for at least 6 years of the 70s decade, Bobby Kennedy would be the face of it all, the one who promised a lot and didn't get results. So there you go. That's the Bobby Kennedy presidency. Bobby wouldn't have really dramatically changed that much. Unless they did the universal healthcare thing, that probably would have been big. But in terms of the big ramifications, it really is just simply because Nixon's not president. As much as Nixon's legacy has really just been Watergate, and really nothing else to your average American who probably couldn't locate Germany on a map, he actually did a lot of things as president, pushed through policy that went into effect. Remember when presidents did that? Me neither. If you know much about Nixon, I'm not gonna give you a full recap, but for those that don't know, here's a few things he did. 1. He made the EPA. That's probably the most commonly known fun fact because it's just funny imagining Nixon signing off on that hippie stuff. 2. He worked to get us out of Vietnam by expanding it. 3. He met with China. 4. He removed the gold standard. 5. He started the war on drugs. And finally 6. He resigned. Yeah, Watergate, I know. Pretty busy for a president that didn't have 2 full terms. While presidents can make policy that otherwise wouldn't have happened without them, general trends in the course of history can sometimes do more whether they were in the driver's seat or not. So, as an example, without Nixon, some environmental agency was going to be made regardless of whether he was there or not. If you lived in the late 60s, you could not escape pollution. A river even caught on fire. No matter what, the federal government was going to get through something to clean up the environment, Bobby Kennedy's seal of approval or not. Without Nixon, we would still get out of Vietnam, but we wouldn't have expanded it to the level that we did. Most particularly, Cambodia. When Nixon was first elected, he said he had a secret plan to get us out of the war, and it turned out that secret plan was crossing borders and bombing the shit out of the Cambodians. The official reason was to take out the Ho Chi Minh Trail and fight the Khmer Rouge. If you want to be kind of cheeky, you can also say that the bombings in the first place led to the Khmer Rouge overthrowing the Cambodian government and just so happened to lead to the Cambodian genocide, but I'm not gonna open that can of worms. Nixon Environmental Agency. That still happens. Let's go back to that. Regardless of Nixon or not, we most likely also would have removed the gold standard within at least a decade or two. I know a lot of people are very angry that he did this, but it was going to happen anyway. Don't debate me on this. The main two decisions that were 100% because of Nixon and Nixon alone was the idea to go to China and starting the war on drugs. Nixon going to China was massive and probably was the most influential decision of his entire presidency. Before that visit, China was disconnected from the US since the end of their own civil war. But Nixon knew that it would be important to reconnect and rebuild that relationship, and we all know how that turned out. So, without Nixon, would Bobby Kennedy have just done the same? You see, if Bobby Kennedy was president, he probably wouldn't have met with China. It would have been a terrible move from an optics standpoint. Nixon visiting the communist Chinese was shocking because he was such a conservative figure. He was one of the most staunch anti-communists, now reaching across the aisle. The fact that he was the one to extend his hand meant the move was more accepted by hardliners. Had Bobby Kennedy done the same, especially after Vietnam, his administration wouldn't just be called cowardly, but traitors as well. The only person who could have visited China and have it come across as a peaceful diplomatic meeting was ironically always going to be a staunch Republican. So in this alternate timeline, what does that mean? I'm saying Reagan. Reagan would visit China instead, because Reagan would probably always have been president, regardless if Bobby Kennedy was president or not. Typically in these things, there's always like 6 or 7 people to choose from. It's not a lot. Reagan almost beat Gerald Ford in the 1976 primaries, and that was when Ford was president. Had Bobby been president for 1 or 2 terms, it would just bring on a Reagan presidency earlier. Sorry, Twitter. And that really is one of the biggest issues with a video like this. Had Bobby Kennedy been president, he would have done alright, but the reaction against him would just bring on the Reagan era sooner. Nixon was the conservative backlash to all of that, and had it not been him, it would have been someone else. Reagan. It would have been Reagan. And Reagan, for reasons I'm not going to get into, was far more influential to the United States today than Nixon ever was. But that's a video remake for another time. Oh, so that's the answer then, huh? Nothing happens? Things stay the same? Well, no. And also, yes. The problem with viewing history as just a series of guys doing things, especially presidencies, is that it gives into this great man view of history. And while 20th century presidents are influential, incredibly influential to global affairs, don't get me wrong, they were also affected by grand societal shifts as much as anybody. And for the United States, there was no shift really bigger than the one coming off of the late 1960s. And sadly, Robert Kennedy's legacy would pay the price. He'd be viewed as the bad Kennedy, while his brother would forever be the good Kennedy. JFK would always be remembered as a good president because he was riding off of the highs of the 50s, while Bobby Kennedy would be remembered as a bad president because he was riding off of the highs of the 60s. But Cody, what about Watergate? Ah, yes, Watergate. I guess it would be true that without a president resigning, there would be more trust in the institution of the presidency, I guess. But how much of that is really true? I'd say more young people in the general public would be just as disillusioned with the United States thanks to the war than if the presidency was wrapped in scandal. As much as we hear about it, it was something very localized to Washington, D.C. Funnily enough, you could say that Watergate's biggest impact is that today, whenever a scandal happens, people like to add gate to the end of it. So I know I haven't talked about him like this entire video, but I would say the biggest impact in this entire scenario is that Jimmy Carter is never president. Now hold on, I know. You see, Jimmy Carter is never president, and so he never is able to sign the Camp David Accords. An action that was meant to bring peace, but it ended up dividing the Arabs against one another. To sum all of that up, it pretty much stopped Egypt from attacking Israel ever again. As for old Bobby Kennedy, he might have been able to pass a healthcare reform bill, and that might have been his biggest accomplishment. With a united Congress to back him up, he could have probably done a lot in 4 years. Oh, and also everything he would do would probably get undone by Reagan. Okay, bye.